For years, Howard Lindell ran his upscale restaurant like a private club, selective and quietly unwelcoming to those who didn't fit his vision. Then one night, two black women walked through the door. He took one look and decided they didn't belong. He thought turning them away would be the end of it, that they'd leave quietly and stay gone. But one of those women was Celeste Warren, and she wasn't just another guest hoping for a table. She was the owner of the building. What followed wasn't loud, just a quiet shift, subtle at first, until the walls around Howard began to close in. Now, the full story is coming to light, and by the time it's over, he'll be begging for her to dine at his restaurant. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The late afternoon sun stretched long and low over the Atlanta skyline, draping everything in the soft amber haze that came just before evening fully arrived. Celeste Warren stepped out of her black Mercedes coupe with the kind of quiet confidence that never needed to be performed. Her heels clicked once against the concrete before she paused, letting her gaze drift upward to the brick facade of the building she owned, its windows aglow with the flicker of early dinner service. Behind her, her best friend Jada exited her car and caught up, already adjusting her hoop earrings with practiced ease. She fell into step beside Celeste, eyes scanning the restaurant entrance as a soft breeze lifted the hem of her dress. "You know, if I owned a building like this," Jada said, half laughing, "I'd have been through here a dozen times by now, just to remind folks who signs the lease." Celeste glanced sideways, amused. "That's exactly why I didn't. There's a difference between presence and performance. I don't need to show up to be in the room." Jada grinned. "Still, tonight's a good excuse. Closing the Harper deal, and now dinner at your own property. That's a full-circle moment if I ever saw one." They walked to the entrance beneath the restaurant's gilded sign, Lindell, with its sleek lettering and ivy-covered frame, the kind of place designed to feel exclusive without saying so outright. Inside, candlelight flickered across glassware, voices hummed over soft jazz, and the aroma of seared meats and herb butter hung in the air like a promise. The young host looked up as they entered, straightening behind the podium with a practiced smile. He was maybe 24, new enough to still be trying, but experienced enough to look like he belonged in his vest and tie. "Good evening," he greeted them warmly. "Do you have a reservation with us tonight?" "No reservation," Celeste replied. "Just the two of us." He nodded without hesitation, his eyes scanning the floor plan behind him. The restaurant was active, but not packed. Several tables were occupied, a few more being cleared, and the bar seats were half full. It wasn't unreasonable to imagine a short wait, but it didn't look like the kind of night where anyone would be turned away. The host reached for two menus from the shelf below the podium. "No problem. I believe I can seat you in just a couple." He stopped. A presence loomed behind him. The young man turned his head slightly as Howard Lindell, the restaurant's owner, stepped up beside him without a word. Howard was dressed in his usual uniform, dark slacks, a collared shirt rolled neatly at the sleeves, and the kind of smile that always looked like it came with terms and conditions. He leaned in and whispered something quietly to the host, too low to hear, but whatever was said made the host instantly retract the menus and step back with both hands folded respectfully in front of him. Howard turned to Celeste and Jada, wearing that same pleasant expression he offered to donors at fundraisers and legacy clients on wine tastings. "Good evening, ladies," he said. "I'm afraid it's going to be about an hour wait tonight. The kitchen's a little backed up, and we're running a full house." Celeste's eyes moved slowly across the room. Occupied, yes, but not swamped. Two empty two-tops were visible near the windows, and a recently cleared booth had just been reset by a server. She turned back to him. "We're happy to wait," she said evenly. Howard gave a slight nod, not expecting that answer. "Sure, just leave your name here with the host, and we'll call you when something opens." Jada raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. The host quietly entered their name into the system, his voice now muted, formal. "We'll be with you as soon as we can." Celeste and Jada stepped aside, moving toward the small waiting area near the entrance. A pair of white couples were already seated there, one of them sipping drinks, the other scrolling through a phone. Celeste remained standing, glancing once more toward the dining room, then folding her hands in front of her. Jada leaned in, her voice low. "There's no way that wait is real," Celeste replied without turning her head. "No, but we'll see how long it takes him to figure out who's waiting." The hum of conversation, the clink of glassware, and the rustle of menus drifted around them, but the air at the entrance had shifted. The host avoided their eyes now, and Howard disappeared back into the kitchen corridor, his job apparently done. Jada folded her arms, watching a new couple walk in, this time white, young, polished. They were greeted warmly. The host consulted his chart, nodded, and led them straight to one of the tables by the window. Celeste didn't react. She just watched and waited, not because she had to, but because sometimes silence spoke louder than the truth people tried to talk their way around. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Celeste remained standing, her posture relaxed but alert, while Jada leaned back against the wall, her arms crossed, and one foot tapping softly against the polished floor. The host, now entirely absorbed in the rhythm of seating guests, no longer looked in their direction. The waiting area had filled and emptied twice, a quiet rotation of couples and parties called by name and ushered to their seats, none of them having waited more than a few minutes. Every so often, a server would glance toward the entrance, their expression momentarily puzzled, but no one said anything. The two black women simply remained near the door, present, visible, and for reasons no one would admit, still waiting. Jada broke the silence first, her voice pitched just low enough not to carry. "It's been 20 minutes, and that couple who walked in after us is already on their second course." She nodded toward a table near the center of the dining room, where a man in a pale blue blazer was twirling pasta onto his fork while laughing at something his date said. Celeste's eyes didn't follow. "I know. Think he forgot we're here?" Jada asked. But there was no humor in it, only a steady undercurrent of annoyance. "No," Celeste said. "He didn't forget." Jada shifted, her patience worn thinner than the cushion on the bench behind her. "This ain't even subtle," she muttered. "I mean, I've seen passive-aggressive. I've seen fake apologies. But this?" Her eyes flicked toward the host again. "This is deliberate. He told that boy not to seat us. You saw it." Celeste nodded slowly, her gaze sweeping the room again. A server passed by with a tray of half-filled wine glasses, and the smell of roasted garlic wafted by, rich and warm, but somehow more distant than it should have been. "The host didn't even look at us after the owner stepped in," Celeste said. "He wanted to seat us. That was instinct. But the moment Howard whispered whatever he whispered, he changed course." Jada blew out a breath through her nose, then pushed away from the wall. "He's lucky I'm not hungry enough to make a scene. 'Cause if I was, we're not making a scene," Celeste said calmly, her tone final but not harsh. "We're making a point." Jada looked at her, reading the calm behind her eyes, the way her body hadn't tensed once since the conversation at the host stand. "You're planning something," she said flatly. Celeste's eyes finally met hers, and there was no denial in them. Another 10 minutes passed. Still no acknowledgement. Another couple arrived. White, mid-30s, clearly regulars judging by the casual wave they gave the host. They were seated within 3 minutes, led to a table that had just been cleared across from the window. Jada watched them settle in with the kind of smile that comes easily to people who have never had to second-guess their welcome. "That's the third set of guests seated since we got here," Jada said, louder now, no longer bothering to hide her frustration. "If it's a 1-hour wait, they must be bending time around here." The host glanced up, caught her eye, and immediately looked away. He busied himself with the reservation book, even though no one was in front of him. His jaw was tight now, as if he knew something wrong was happening but lacked the authority, or perhaps the courage, to undo it. Celeste shifted slightly, just enough to step forward. She wasn't going to speak yet, but she wanted to be sure she was visible, a gentle reminder. not a challenge. Her presence alone was a quiet pressure. Then, as if summoned by the atmosphere itself, Howard emerged again from the rear hallway, wiping his hands on a linen towel and feigning surprise at seeing them still near the door. "Oh, you're still waiting?" he asked, his voice coated in feigned concern, like a father discovering his children hadn't yet been fed. "We were told it would be about an hour," Celeste replied, voice smooth, even. "It's been 30. He nodded slowly, lips pressing together in that practiced expression that always preceded some excuse. "Yes, well, unfortunately, we've had a few table turnovers slower than expected. Folks are lingering tonight. You know how it is." "I do," Celeste said, her eyes locked onto his. "That's why I know you've seated multiple walk-ins since we arrived." Howard's smile faltered, briefly, but he recovered. "I can assure you, we're managing tables as quickly as we can. I'll check in with the kitchen, see if anything's freeing up soon." "No need," Celeste said. "We're fine waiting." That threw him again, but only for a moment. He gave a short nod, turned, and walked briskly back into the kitchen. Jada leaned closer. "You know he was hoping we'd leave." "Yes," Celeste murmured. "That was the idea." She settled onto the bench this time, crossing one leg over the other, her gaze now fixed on nothing in particular. She wasn't in a rush. The wait wasn't a punishment. It was a mirror, one she was letting Howard hold up to himself, and he didn't even realize yet how much of his own reflection he was about to see. Another 20 minutes passed, and by now, the low thrum of the restaurant had settled into a steady rhythm of silverware tapping plates, wine being poured, and servers weaving between tables like a practiced ballet. To an outsider, nothing looked out of place, but from where Celeste and Jada sat near the entrance, the discrepancy was undeniable. They'd seen guests arrive, be greeted, seated, served, and now laugh quietly over dessert menus, while their own names remained untouched on the wait list. The host had long stopped pretending. He no longer met their eyes, no longer offered updates, no longer moved toward the podium unless someone else walked through the door. He kept his hands busy adjusting silverware rolls and straightening menus that didn't need straightening, and each time he did, it became clearer that whatever authority he might have once held had been taken from him the moment Howard stepped in. Jada shifted again on the bench, eyes trained on the dining room like she was waiting for it to give her permission to act. 45 minutes, she said under her breath. At this point, he's not even trying to lie well. Celeste rose without a word. Jada looked up at her, waiting for some cue, but Celeste simply smoothed the front of her blazer and walked, calm, slow, each step measured, past the host stand, around the corner of the dining room, and toward the hallway that led toward the kitchen. Jada followed half a beat later, sensing what was coming without needing it explained. Howard had just emerged from the back, adjusting his cuffs and laughing at something a server had said. His face changed the moment he saw them. The laugh died mid-breath. "Ladies," he greeted again, his voice forced into politeness so quickly it cracked. "Still waiting, I see." Celeste stopped in front of him, her presence so centered it made the narrow hallway feel smaller. "Yes, nearly an hour now." Howard offered a shrug designed to look regretful. "I do apologize. Sometimes these things happen. We can't force our guests to leave if they're enjoying themselves." "Then why did you seat the couple that arrived 20 minutes after us?" Celeste asked, her voice composed, almost casual. "The ones who've just started dessert at the window?" Howard's mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again. "They had called ahead. We were holding a table." "No," Jada cut in. "You said you weren't taking any walk-ins. We were the ones who walked in before them. You said it'd be an hour because the kitchen was behind." Howard's smile tightened, corners straining. "Ma'am, I don't think it's appropriate to make assumptions about how we operate." "No assumptions," Celeste said. "Just facts. We watched you make a choice, and we've been sitting in the front window of your restaurant watching that choice play out over the past 45 minutes. He drew in a breath, as if about to protest, but Celeste's voice came again before he could. "I'd like you to say it plainly," she said. You're not seating us. Not because the tables are full. Not because of a kitchen delay. Not because we were walk-ins. He blinked. Excuse me? I want you to say it, she repeated, her tone still even but unmistakably firmer now. Tell us why you wouldn't seat us tonight. I don't have to explain myself to you, Howard said, the words brittle, like they were being chipped from a wall he hadn't meant to stand so close to. But you will, Jada snapped, because you made this personal the second you tried to lie your way through a policy that only applies to us. Howard's gaze snapped to her. Listen, I don't appreciate you two coming in here and turning this into something it's not. We have standards here. Standards of conduct, of presentation, of clientele. This is a refined establishment. Celeste didn't move. And we aren't refined? He scoffed. I didn't say that. No, you implied it. Loudly. Howard took a step forward, now past the veneer of charm and into the territory of someone who realized he'd already lost control and was scrambling to salvage authority. Look, I run a certain kind of restaurant. My regulars expect a certain experience. That experience includes atmosphere, tone, the kind of evening that isn't disrupted by excessive noise or energy. Jada narrowed her eyes. You mean black women. His face flushed. That's not what I said, but it's what you meant, Celeste said, her voice low now, not because it had lost strength, but because it no longer needed to rise. You looked at us, and you saw trouble. You saw stereotypes. You saw whatever image you've carried in your mind all these years. Loud, disruptive, unworthy of your ambiance. That's why you stepped in when your host was about to seat us. You didn't see women. You didn't see professionals. You saw color, and you made a decision. For a moment, the hallway felt too quiet. Even the kitchen sounds in the background seemed to dim, replaced by the heavy stillness of someone's truth being held in front of them like a mirror they never meant to look into. Howard didn't answer. He just stood there, mouth tight, jaw flexing, silence thick around him. Celeste gave a slow nod. We'll go, she said finally. We've seen enough. Howard exhaled, clearly relieved, like he'd won something. But Celeste wasn't finished. She paused at the corner, then turned back to him one last time. You should remember tonight, Mr. Lindell, not because you turned away a pair of guests, but because you made that choice inside a building you don't even own. He blinked. Excuse me? She smiled softly, almost pitying. You heard me. Then she turned, heels clicking softly against the hardwood as she walked away, Jada following close behind, her expression tight with fury, but her steps steady. The door opened. The night air swept in, and they were gone, leaving Howard standing in the hallway, suddenly unsure of the ground beneath him, wondering if he'd just insulted someone far more powerful than he could afford to offend. The streetlights had just begun to hum to life as Celeste and Jada stepped out onto the sidewalk, the evening air cooler now, tinged with the faint scent of spring jasmine and exhaust. The laughter and clinking glasses from inside the restaurant faded behind them, replaced by the low rhythm of passing cars and the soft scuff of their shoes against pavement. Celeste didn't speak. Not yet. Her expression was unreadable, composed as always, though the stillness in her eyes carried a weight that had not been there earlier. Jada, however, was vibrating with the kind of restrained fury that never stayed quiet for long. You handled that better than I would have, she muttered, glancing back toward the restaurant doors. I wanted to knock that smug look right off his face. Celeste exhaled slowly. That's not what he'd remember. He'd forget that within the hour. This, she gestured vaguely, her voice calm. This will stay with him. Jada opened her mouth to reply, but the glass door behind them burst open before she could speak. Howard stormed out onto the sidewalk, his face flushed, his stride fast and uneven like a man trying to catch up to a mistake he hadn't expected to make. His sleeves were still rolled, his apron slung over one shoulder now, more barkeep than businessman, more raw than refined. Hey, he barked. the word slicing through the night as he approached. "You don't walk into my restaurant and speak to me like that." Celeste turned to face him, not startled, just patient. "Is there something you'd like to clarify, Mr. Lindell? You don't come into my place making accusations, throwing around veiled threats about who owns what," he snapped, pointing a stiff finger toward the building. "You don't know how hard I've worked to build a space like this. You think you can just barge in and act like you're owed something because you—" He caught himself. Too late. Jada took a step forward. "Because she what?" Howard looked at her, his expression twitching with something sour and unmasked. "You know what I meant." "No," Celeste said, her voice sharp now, slicing through his excuse before he could hide behind it. "Say it. Say exactly what you meant." He laughed once, short and hollow. "You people think you can just cry racism whenever something doesn't go your way." Jada's fists clenched at her sides. "You people? Really?" Howard's voice rose now, volume spilling over onto the empty sidewalk. "Yes, you come in, dressed to be seen, expecting special treatment, just waiting for someone to slip up so you can claim you've been wronged. Well, I'm not playing that game." "No one asked for special treatment," Celeste said, still unmoved. "We asked for a table, one that was clearly available. You made the choice to deny service. You lied. And when confronted, you doubled down on every tired, condescending stereotype that made you think you were justified." He stepped in closer, anger boiling over now. "And now you want to threaten me with some building ownership nonsense? I don't care who your boyfriend is or what business you think you run. This is my restaurant. I decide who comes through that door." Celeste's brow arched slightly. "You're right. You do decide, and you decided wrong. You're banned," he growled. "You hear me? You and your friend. Don't ever set foot in my restaurant again." Jada laughed, a single hard sound that drew a sharp turn of Celeste's head. "Oh, we're banned?" she said, stepping forward now, her fury no longer held in check. "After waiting an hour, after watching 3 couples get seated before us, after you straight up said we didn't belong because we might ruin your atmosphere, you don't ever have to worry about us setting foot in your little clubhouse again." Celeste placed a hand on Jada's arm, grounding her, steadying her. Then she looked back at Howard. "You don't know who I am?" she said, quiet but cutting. "And that's your mistake. You looked at me and saw what you wanted to see. Just another black woman you could talk around, dismiss, ignore. But you didn't stop to ask yourself how someone like me might have ended up here. You didn't think it was possible that I wasn't someone walking through your front door, but someone who had the keys to the building you're standing in," he scoffed. "You expect me to believe that?" Celeste tilted her head. "I don't care if you believe it. The lease renewal will make it clear enough." He laughed again, but it didn't carry the same certainty. There was a note of hesitation now, a stutter in his confidence. "You're bluffing." She took a step closer. Not aggressive, not loud, just present. Her voice was steady, refined, and utterly final. "I'm not." Howard looked at her long, and for the first time he seemed to actually see her, not as a customer, not as a problem, but as something he hadn't anticipated, a woman with the power to decide his future. Something about that realization took the wind from his chest, and though he tried to recover it with another flurry of words, the fire had started to fade behind his eyes. Celeste turned without waiting for a response, walking toward her car. Jada gave him one last glare before following, the tension crackling behind them as they moved. The engine roared to life, headlights cutting across the restaurant's glowing windows as they pulled away, and Howard Lindell remained on the sidewalk, standing in front of a building he didn't own, watching a woman he had just tried to diminish drive away with his comfort, his pride, and, soon, his business. The city moved around her, but Celeste remained still. The next morning unfolded like any other. Cars threading through the early haze, emails flooding her inbox, texts from board members and brokers blinking across her phone, but beneath the normal rhythm was something quieter, heavier. Not rage, not resentment, just resolve. That clean, quiet kind that didn't need fanfare. She sat on the balcony of her condo overlooking Piedmont Park, a porcelain mug warming her hands, steam rising in thin ribbons as the sunlight crept across the horizon. She hadn't spoken much after the drive home. Jada had filled the silence with sharp commentary and rightful outrage. But Celeste had absorbed it without reply, her thoughts already turning inward, piecing together something deeper than a reaction. She didn't believe in explosions. She believed in pressure, strategic, precise, unrelenting. When her phone buzzed again, she glanced at the screen. A message from her property manager, Malik Vaughn. She answered on the first ring. "Morning," she said, her voice low but clear. "Morning, Ms. Warren," Malik replied. "I saw your message. You want a rent audit on the Lindell lease?" "I do. Pull the last 2 years. I want to see how much they've benefited from the discounted rate." "Understood," he said, and his tone shifted as he added, "Everything okay?" Celeste paused, her eyes drifting across the skyline. "No, but it will be." He didn't ask more. Malik knew better than most how Celeste operated. She wasn't reactionary. She never moved without cause. If she was reaching out, it meant something had crossed a line. And whatever it was, it would be addressed with the kind of precision most people didn't see coming until it was too late. After the call ended, she sat for a while longer, letting the breeze drift past her like an old thought. Her mind retraced the night before. Not the shouting or the insults, not even Howard's condescension. It was the moment he laughed when she told him she owned the building, that little flicker of disbelief, like the idea of her owning the ground he walked on was too far-fetched to take seriously. That was the moment it became clear. This wasn't about feelings. This was about reminders, about making sure the ones who thought they could speak over her, block her path, or pretend she didn't belong, understood just how far she reached. Later that afternoon, she met Jada at her office. High ceilings, warm wood accents, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown. The Warren Equity Group logo gleamed behind the reception desk. Understated, but unmistakable. Jada didn't bother sitting down right away. She stood near the window, arms crossed, still wound tight from the night before. "So," she said, turning slowly, "what's the plan?" Celeste didn't answer immediately. She opened a file on her desk, one that had been quietly building in the background since she'd acquired the building. Property assessments, lease details, tenant histories, everything was there. She slid it closer to the edge of the desk, then looked up. "The restaurant's rent is 18% below market value. That was a courtesy extended to the previous owner when we took over. I let it stand for stability." Jada raised an eyebrow. "And now? I'm done being generous to people who think I don't belong in my own spaces. So you're raising it?" Celeste nodded. "Substantially. A 42% increase will bring it in line with current rates. No more discounts for disrespect." Jada finally took a seat, exhaling with a slow grin. "God, I love when you get surgical with it." Celeste didn't smile. "This isn't about punishment. This is about principle, about boundaries. He made a choice, and now he's going to feel it in the numbers first. That's where his pride lives anyway." Jada tilted her head. "You think he'll fight it?" "Absolutely. But he won't win." Celeste pulled another folder from her drawer and opened it. Inside were financial reports from Lindell submitted during their last lease renewal. The margins had been tight, manageable only because of the reduced rent. A 42% increase wouldn't just sting, it would force a reckoning. "He'll scramble," she continued, "cut costs, slash hours, beg for leniency. But the terms were agreed upon 2 years ago. He had the benefit of a soft landing. Now he can learn what accountability feels like." Jada leaned forward. "And when he asks for a meeting?" Celeste's gaze didn't waver. "I'll give it to him. And when he walks in and sees it's you, that'll be the real lesson." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what was coming settling between them. Celeste didn't take pleasure in what she was about to do. This wasn't vengeance. It was restoration. A balancing of scales that had been tilted too long in favor of men like Howard, who believed ownership looked a certain way, sounded a certain way, and never resembled the woman who calmly stood her ground the night before. She closed the file and stood, walking toward the window beside Jada. Below, the city moved with its usual rhythm, unaware of the quiet storm forming several stories above it. "You know what I've learned," Celeste said, her voice low, almost thoughtful. "Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just rewrites the terms, quietly, permanently." Jada looked over at her, a slow grin forming. "Remind me to never get on your bad side." Celeste finally allowed herself the smallest smile. "You couldn't afford it." And with that, she turned back to her desk, ready to begin the slow, deliberate process of teaching Howard Lindell the one lesson he'd never forget. Ownership was not about presence. It was about control, and she already had it. The email arrived in Howard's inbox just after 9 on Monday morning, buried between supplier invoices and a notice about sidewalk permitting from the city. It came from Warren Equity Group's Property Management Division, stamped with the crisp signature of Malik Vaughn, and titled plainly, "Lease Rate Adjustment, effective April 1st. He clicked it half-interested, assuming it was some minor update about parking access or updated recycling rules. But the moment he reached the second paragraph, the blood in his face began to rise. He read it twice, then a third time. By the fourth reading, the words weren't any softer. A 42% rent increase. Non-negotiable. Effective in 30 days. No phased plan. No warning. No courtesy call. Just a number so aggressive it knocked the wind from his chest and replaced it with fury. He pushed back from his desk hard enough to send his chair spinning. The kitchen staff looked up from their prep work through the office window, but he didn't care. He grabbed his phone and dialed the number in the signature block. It rang once, twice, then voicemail. He hung up, paced once, then dialed again. This time, he left a message. Controlled, polite. He asked for a meeting. Said he needed to speak to someone in person. Used phrases like long-standing tenant, mutual interest, and need for clarification. When he hung up, he sat down slowly. The room around him oddly smaller now, more fragile. By midweek, the reply came. A brief, courteous email confirming a meeting at the property office for Friday at 10 a.m. No names attached, just an address, a time, and a line at the bottom that read, "A representative of Warren Equity Group will meet you in Suite 610. Howard showed up 5 minutes early, dressed in the same kind of confidence he wore at fundraisers and food expos. He came with his clipboard, his lease copy marked up, and a folder of spreadsheets he barely understood but believed would lend him weight in the conversation. He took the elevator up, rehearsing his points, preparing to push back, to argue, to remind whoever sat across from him that he wasn't someone to be shoved around. The receptionist was polite, asked him to wait, offered coffee. He declined. 10 minutes later, a door down the hall opened, and a soft voice called his name. He stood, straightened his cuffs, picked up his folder, and when he stepped into the room and saw who was waiting for him, something in his spine stiffened, like it had been struck. Celeste Warren stood at the head of the conference table, not seated, not flanked by assistants, not guarded by a team of lawyers, just her, calm, poised, dressed in a slate-gray suit that seemed to absorb the morning light and turn it cold. She extended a hand with the grace of someone who didn't need it accepted. "Mr. Lindell," she said, "glad you could make it." For half a second, Howard didn't move. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, shaking her hand with the hesitation of someone already unsure whether they were supposed to be here. "You work here?" he asked, though the question felt stale the moment it left his mouth. "I own here," Celeste replied evenly. "This office, this floor, and the building your restaurant occupies." He said nothing. The silence stretched just long enough for her to gesture to the seat across from her. "Have a seat. Let's talk." Howard sat, clumsily adjusting his folder like it might shield him from the unease creeping into his chest. "So, you're the head of Warren Equity?" "I am Warren Equity." His mouth opened, then shut again. She didn't give him time to recover. You received our rate adjustment notice. He cleared his throat. I did. That's actually why I requested this meeting. There must be some kind of mistake. I've been leasing that space for 6 years. We've had a good relationship with your company since the beginning. Celeste nodded once. The rate adjustment reflects the current market. Your lease was previously extended under favorable conditions negotiated with the building's prior owner. But that contract expired last quarter. You've been month to month since then. I've been a model tenant, he said, the edge returning to his voice. No violations, no complaints. I've kept the storefront pristine. I've brought in clientele that elevates the block. And yet, Celeste said quietly, when I visited last week as a customer, you turned me away at the door. His eyes snapped to hers, confusion giving way to recognition, and then disbelief. That was you? I was the one you refused to seat, she replied. The one you told didn't fit your atmosphere. He blinked. Look, that had nothing to do with. You didn't know who I was, she continued, still calm. And so you made a decision. Now I'm making one too. This is retaliation, he snapped. That's what this is. You're upset because of some misunderstanding, and now you're abusing your position. The rent increase is standard, she said, cutting him off without raising her voice. You're welcome to stay and pay it, or leave. You think I can absorb a 40% spike in 1 year? Celeste leaned back, folding her hands on the table. If you can afford to turn down paying guests, I assumed your margins were healthy. His jaw tensed. You're trying to put me out of business? No, she said, rising from her chair. I'm reminding you that you don't own the spaces you think you control. You just rent them. He stood as well now, folder forgotten, voice rising. You'll regret this. I'll take legal action. You're free to do so, she said. But I suggest reading your lease first. You'll find it's airtight. Howard stared at her, the blood rising in his neck, the words forming behind his teeth but never finding a dignified way out. She gave him nothing else. No apology, no compromise, no explanation. He shook his head, short and sharp. You think this is about money? About rent? This is personal. Don't pretend it isn't. She paused, eyes meeting his one last time. You made it personal the moment you decided I didn't belong at your table. Howard's face flushed deep, an ugly color blooming beneath his collar. You don't get to talk down to me. I built that place, from scratch, before this block was even worth something. I was there when half these buildings were boarded up, when no one wanted to park here, let alone dine here. And now some smug landlord thinks she can just hike my rent and look me in the eye like I'm disposable? Celeste didn't flinch. You are not being looked at like anything, Mr. Lindell. You're being held accountable under the terms of a contract you signed. You blindsided me. No, you dismissed me. The truth landed, too clean for him to dodge, and the fury that had been bubbling inside him now surged with nowhere left to go. He stepped around the end of the table too quickly, as if forward motion alone would overpower the sense of powerlessness curling around his spine. You know what your problem is? He snapped. You think because you've got a few buildings and a custom signature and a title on your email that it makes you better. You walk around with your nose in the air like the rest of us are supposed to fall in line. You think owning a block makes you untouchable, but this isn't going to end the way you think. Celeste stood still, back straight, her hands folded neatly in front of her. I don't think I'm untouchable, Mr. Lindell. I think I'm uninterested in being touched. He stared at her, chest rising and falling with uneven breaths, and for a second she saw it. The shift from arrogance to something messier, something desperate and wounded beneath the fury. But it didn't move her. She'd seen that look too many times before. It always came after the first real no, when men who had never been challenged realized the rules weren't written for them anymore. You're arrogant, he spat, as if the word itself might wound. You walk into my place like you own it. I do own it, she said simply. The words hit with the weight of fact, not triumph. Howard turned away then, a sharp, bitter twist of motion. He paced toward the far wall of the conference room, hands running through his graying hair, muttering something under his breath that Celeste didn't bother to catch. He stopped, turned back, fire still in his eyes. "You want to crush my business? Fine. Go ahead. But don't pretend this is some righteous move. Don't stand there and pretend this is about policy and contracts and clean hands. You wanted to punish me, and you're hiding behind paperwork to do it." Celeste let the accusation hang for a moment before replying, her voice soft, controlled. "I don't hide behind anything." He sneered. "Yeah? Then why not just admit it? You didn't like being turned away. And now you're trying to ruin me." "I didn't like being underestimated," she said, taking a step toward the door. "But I'm not trying to ruin you, Mr. Lindell. I'm just done protecting people like you from the consequences of their own choices." Her hand brushed the polished metal handle, but before she opened the door, she turned back once more, not out of anger, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. "You built your restaurant on this block, but you built it thinking people like me should only ever walk past it. You should have considered that one day someone like me might stop walking and start buying." She stepped out into the hallway, the soft click of the door behind her sealing the conversation with a finality Howard hadn't anticipated. He stood in the middle of the room, flushed and trembling, surrounded by the folders he'd brought to defend his territory, and for the first time in years, he realized how little ground he actually owned. It wasn't just the building he'd lost control over. It was the narrative, the illusion, the world he thought he could dictate with charm and firmness and a bit of plausible deniability. He stormed out of the office 15 seconds later, shoulder-brushing past the receptionist's desk without a word. His footsteps echoed through the lobby, sharp and angry, each one louder than the last, until the door slammed behind him and the building fell quiet once more. And still, Celeste said nothing. She didn't need to, because when control is real, it never needs to shout. The courtroom was quiet, sterile, and unforgiving. Its pale wood panels and high ceilings gave no comfort, no warmth, no room for ego. The kind of place that flattened theatrics into dust. Howard sat at the plaintiff's table, jaw set, arms stiff across his chest, flanked by his attorney, Walter Briggs, who, despite his reputation for quiet efficiency, carried the tense air of a man already preparing to lose. Across the aisle, Celeste sat with her counsel, Marcus Clay, a tall, soft-spoken attorney with the kind of courtroom presence that didn't announce itself, but slowly consumed the space with every word. Celeste's posture remained unchanged, serene as ever. Her gaze settled on Howard, as if he were simply the next inevitable step in a process she had already mapped out weeks ago. The judge entered briskly, and within moments the hearing was underway. Howard had sued on the grounds of what he called retaliatory rent adjustment, a claim that rested on the accusation that Celeste, as landlord, had targeted him personally after a so-called misunderstanding at his restaurant. He insisted that the rent increase was punitive, unprofessional, and outside the bounds of reasonable business practice. But the moment Walter began his opening argument, the weaknesses in their case began to show. His language danced carefully around the incident in the restaurant, never naming it directly, relying instead on vague suggestions of unexplained hostility, a sudden shift in terms, and behavior inconsistent with standard landlord-tenant dynamics. He spoke of Howard's tenure, his supposed commitment to the neighborhood, and the unfairness of a 42% rent increase delivered without meaningful negotiation. But when Marcus stood, adjusting his cuffs and taking a step toward the judge, his tone was colder, dispassionate, clinical, and devastating. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is a waste of court time. The plaintiff is a month-to-month tenant operating under an expired lease. The landlord, my client, is well within her legal rights to raise rent at the end of that term, provided adequate notice is given, which in this case it was. Furthermore, the new rate is consistent with every commercial tenant on the block and aligns with documented market trends in the area." He handed the judge a folder without looking at Howard, his voice smooth as stone. "You'll find enclosed local comps, leasing data, prior communications, and the original agreement signed by Mr. Lindell, all of which make it explicitly clear that the defendant not only acted within her rights, but with restraint." The judge nodded, flipping open the packet with a furrowed brow. Howard leaned toward Walter, whispering fiercely, "Push back. He's steamrolling us." Walter didn't respond. His fingers tapped the table, slow and silent. Marcus continued, "Additionally, I'd like to note that while the plaintiff's claim suggests retaliation, he has not produced a single piece of evidence, no emails, no texts, no witnesses, to substantiate that the increase was anything but standard business practice. What he has produced is a personal narrative with no legal standing, framed by resentment and self-inflicted damage." Howard surged forward. "That's a lie." The judge raised a hand. "Mr. Lindell, sit down." He did, reluctantly, his glare fixed on Celeste now, as though daring her to break eye contact, but she didn't flinch, didn't blink. She didn't even look angry. She looked finished. Walter tried to recover. He pushed a folder forward. "Your Honor, we do have documentation of the prior lease terms and the plaintiff's consistent payment record over 6 years, which shows a clear pattern of good faith tenancy. We believe that such a sharp increase immediately following a personal altercation," his voice cut in again, this time sharper, "is not illegal nor uncommon, especially in cases where the previous rate was below market and no lease was in place. Mr. Lindell gambled on stability without securing it on paper. Now he's trying to litigate his way into a discount." The judge looked up. "Do you have anything to rebut the defendant's market data?" Walter hesitated. "Not directly. Our argument is primarily based on the abruptness of the increase and the context surrounding it." The judge's face didn't shift, but something in her posture cooled further. "Then I'm not sure what legal remedy you're hoping to find here." Howard stood again, his voice strained but trying to regain ground. "I built that business from the ground up. I've been a part of that block for years, long before she came in and started throwing around property rights like a hammer. I've kept that corner respectable. My customers, your customers," Marcus said quietly, "are not relevant to the lease you failed to renegotiate." "And what about how she showed up?" Howard pressed. "Pretending to be a customer, waiting just to trap me." The judge's gavel cracked once against the bench. "That's enough. This is not a platform for personal grievances." Celeste hadn't spoken once. She didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said was in the contract, in the data, and in the clear imbalance between the emotions swelling at Howard's table and the calm certainty of her own. When the judge finally spoke again, her decision came without hesitation. "The plaintiff has failed to demonstrate any breach of contract or unlawful conduct by the defendant. The rent increase was legally permissible and reasonably supported. This case is dismissed." She struck her gavel again and rose, the courtroom shifting as the tension released like air from a sealed room. Howard stood there, stunned, watching as Celeste rose with quiet grace, shook Marcus's hand, and turned without a backward glance. He didn't follow her. He couldn't, not anymore. And as she stepped out of the courtroom, her heels echoing softly down the polished hall, it became clear. His real defeat hadn't been in the courtroom. It had been that night at the door when he saw a black woman and decided that was all she was. Now, the cost of that mistake had a dollar figure, a lease termination, and a judgment that would outlive his bitterness. The courthouse steps were warm under the early afternoon sun, polished stone glowing pale gold beneath the sharp blue sky, and Celeste was nearly to the curb when she heard his voice rise behind her again, louder this time, more frantic. "You think this is over?" Howard called, forcing the words through a tight throat, his pace quickening to close the distance between them. "You think a judge's ruling is the end of this?" Celeste didn't turn around, not immediately. She stopped just before the crosswalk, adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, then faced him slowly, her expression unreadable, composed, the weight of the moment settling around her like silk instead of armor. Howard approached, face flushed, jaw clenched in that way men carried when pride was all they had left to hold. His tie was slightly askew, and there was a crumpled printout of the court's dismissal letter sticking from the edge of his folder. His eyes were sharp now, not with logic, but with something more primal, wounded ego wrapped in purpose. "I'm not going to disappear," he said, voice low but quick, crowding the air between them. "You can sit in there with your lawyer and play queen of the block, but people are going to know what you did. I'm going to make damn sure of it." Celeste tilted her head slightly. "What I did? You drove a small business owner out with some corporate rent hike, after pretending to be a customer just to trap me. That's what happened. That's the story, and I'm going to tell it." She looked at him, long and still. "You're going to lie." "I'm going to tell the parts that matter," he snapped, voice growing louder, "the ones people care about. That a local restaurant got crushed by a greedy property firm, that I fought for my business, and you slammed me with a rent increase out of nowhere. You're leaving things out." "I'm choosing the angle," he corrected, eyes shining now with something closer to certainty. "You think the public cares about technicalities? You think they'll dig through court records and lease terms? No, they'll see a black-owned real estate company gutting a restaurant in a historic neighborhood, and that's all they'll need." He stepped back slightly now, his breath slowing as the confidence began to return to his posture. "You think you're untouchable because you won in court? I'm going to show people how dangerous you really are." Celeste blinked once, slowly. "Do what you feel you need to." "Oh, I will," he said. "Interviews, social media, blogs, forums, community boards, everywhere. I'll make you the face of gentrification. You don't think I know how to tell a story? I think you know how to bury a truth," she replied softly. But Howard was already turning, already planning the next move in a war she wasn't playing. And in the days that followed, the story began to spread, not loud at first, not fast, but steady. He released a video shot from inside the restaurant, framed to show warm lighting and rows of empty tables behind him. He spoke about the rise in rent prices, the burden placed on local businesses, the threat of big real estate groups pushing out longtime tenants. He never said Celeste's name, never mentioned the lawsuit, never referred to the judge's ruling, and absolutely never acknowledged the real reason this had all begun. Instead, he spoke of legacy, of community, of being punished for speaking up. And people listened. The story was picked up by a neighborhood blog, then reshared on a citywide Facebook group. Then it hit Twitter, and from there, it took on a shape of its own, shared by small business advocates, picked up by an activist with a sizable following, and eventually reframed by a local media outlet as "the cost of commercial control is development silencing neighborhood culture." Support flooded in. People commented with outrage, resharing his version, demanding accountability from Warren Equity Group. The words boycott, corporate greed, and gentrifier appeared in posts with hundreds of likes. A few even organized a Save Lindell rally in front of the restaurant, holding signs that read, "Support small business and stop the rent hikes." And through it all, Celeste remained silent. She read the articles, saw the edited videos, scrolled past the threads that twisted her role into something villainous. Jada fumed beside her one afternoon, waving her phone in disbelief. "This is trash. You should respond." Celeste shook her head. "Let him talk. He's controlling the narrative. For now." Jada paced, unable to sit still. "He didn't even mention what he said to us. Not a word about how he treated you. And now he's out here painting himself like a folk hero, while people are calling you a slumlord." Celeste glanced up, calm and unmoved. "Let them call me what they want. It doesn't change the lease. It doesn't change the judgment. But your name was never his to define." Jada stopped, caught by the certainty in Celeste's voice. "So, you're not going to fight back?" Celeste turned toward her, eyes cool but steady. "I already did. And I won. This noise? She waved toward the screen. "It'll fade. The facts won't." And just like that, she returned to her work, her quiet stillness undisturbed. Because she understood something Howard never had. Public sentiment was a wave. It swelled, crashed, receded. But ownership was the tide. And the tide answered to no one. By the end of the week, Howard's story had gone from a simmer to a boil. His edited videos were circulating like wildfire, his talking points being repeated in tweets, comment threads, and community newsletters by people who had never met him, never eaten at his restaurant, and certainly never read a lease agreement. But none of that mattered, not to them, and certainly not to him. What mattered was the momentum, the illusion of winning, the rush of being seen, of being rallied around, of being cast in the role he had written for himself. The only problem was Celeste's silence. Every morning, Howard checked Warren Equity's website, their socials, their press page, expecting a response, a carefully worded statement, a damage control press release, some indication that he'd forced her hand. But nothing came. No comment, no clarification, no engagement at all. He watched the silence stretch from one day to the next until it became unbearable. He had thrown everything at her: shame, pressure, public outcry, and still nothing. It was as if she'd wrapped herself in steel and let the storm pass without flinching. And that, more than the court ruling, more than the lease, more than anything, was what drove him to act again. He needed the noise to get louder. He needed it to be physical. And so, the next Monday morning, while the city stirred to life around the glass towers of Midtown Atlanta, Howard arrived outside the front entrance of Warren Equity Group's main office with a handmade sign, a borrowed megaphone, and a small cluster of supporters who had been coaxed into showing up through DMs, comments, and vague promises of standing up for community business. The protest wasn't large, no more than a dozen people. But it was loud. Howard stood front and center, voice amplified through the plastic cone of the megaphone, shouting phrases he had practiced the night before in front of his bathroom mirror. Landlords don't get to decide who stays and who gets pushed out. She raised the rent to silence a local business. We're not leaving until we're heard. Some of the signs were crude, others catchy. One woman held a placard that read, "Don't price us out." Another held a phone on a selfie stick, live streaming every chant, every horn honk from a passing car. Every moment, Howard pointed to the reflective office windows and called Celeste out by name. Employees entering the building kept their heads down. Some stepped around the crowd, others waited until security escorted them in through the side entrance. Building management made a few calls, and by the time noon hit, the protest had made its way into local news snippets and was beginning to trend under the hashtag #ReachSaveLindell. Inside, from her corner office on the 15th floor, Celeste stood by the window, hands folded calmly in front of her as she looked down at the commotion unfolding below. Her expression didn't change. She watched as Howard paced in front of the building, waving his sign between chants, face glistening with sweat, voice growing hoarser with each repetition of the script. Behind her, Jada hovered, arms folded, watching too, but with considerably less serenity. "This is getting ridiculous," she muttered. "He's got people out there holding signs like you're a war criminal. And that woman with the phone, she's live streaming it to hundreds. They're calling you a gentrifier now. You realize that?" Celeste nodded once, eyes still on the crowd. "He's trying to force a reaction," Jada went on, "trying to provoke you into fighting in a place he knows how to play dirty. And you're just going to stand here and let him rewrite the truth with hashtags?" Celeste finally turned from the window, her voice even. "No," Jada blinked. "So what are you going to do?" Celeste walked to her desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a folder she had placed there 4 days earlier, untouched until now. She laid it flat on the surface, opened it, and began flipping through the pages. Plans, numbers, floor layouts, proposals. Her fingertips moved with purpose, but she didn't speak right away. Jada stepped closer, peering down at the documents. "Is this?" Celeste nodded once. "I'm going to end the noise, Jada. But not with a press conference, not with a counter-campaign. That's not my lane." Jada looked up at her, brow furrowed. "Then what is?" Celeste met her eyes, and for the first time in days, there was a shift in her tone. Not sharp, not angry, but resolute in a way that sounded like something final. "Control," she said. "That's my lane." She closed the folder, her hand resting lightly on the cover. "This ends on my terms." And just like that, she sat down, composed, calm, already moving on to the next step. Because while Howard screamed at the sky below, desperately trying to be heard, Celeste was preparing something far more permanent. Not noise, not spectacle, action. The next morning, the sun rose over Atlanta like it always did, quietly, steadily, unaware of the noise still rippling through the city below. The protest outside Warren Equity Group's offices had thinned, but the posts remained, shared and reshared by voices both earnest and opportunistic. The story still lived online, mutating by the hour. Celeste Warren, they said, was a ruthless developer, a gentrifier in corporate clothing, a woman who raised rents to punish a beloved local restaurant owner who dared to stand up to her. But inside the polished glass tower where she worked, there was no panic. No damage control team scrambling to draft apologies. No frantic meetings about how to mitigate public fallout. Just Celeste, sitting in the same seat she always did, calm, collected, and ready. Her assistant entered quietly, setting a tablet in front of her. The draft was open, the post already written, waiting only for her to hit send. Jada stood nearby, arms folded, her expression unreadable. "You sure about this?" she asked. Celeste glanced up at her, then back down at the screen. "It's time." Jada gave a small nod, then stepped aside. Celeste reached forward and tapped the screen once. The post went live at 8:12 a.m. It began with a photo, not of her, not of the restaurant, but of the court's official ruling. One clean image, the judge's stamped signature at the bottom, followed by the caption, "Facts matter." Let's talk about what actually happened. The post unfolded in a thread, simple and direct. No filters, no dramatics, just facts. "I am Celeste Warren, founder and owner of Warren Equity Group. I am also the legal owner of the building that houses Lindell Restaurant. 2 months ago, I entered Lindell as a customer with a close friend. We were not served. We were told there would be a 1-hour wait, despite several open tables. Multiple parties who arrived after us were seated immediately. When we calmly questioned it, the owner emerged, offered us nothing but deflection, and ultimately told us, 'You can't eat here.' I chose to leave. I did not argue. I did not threaten. I simply walked away. What Mr. Lindell did not know at the time was that I was his landlord, that I had purchased the building 2 years prior, and that he had been operating on a month-to-month lease after his contract expired last quarter. I reviewed his lease terms and raised the rent to current market rate, not as retaliation, but because his prior rate, extended as a courtesy to the previous owner, was 18% below market. He responded by suing me. He lost. The judge dismissed his case in full, citing clear legal precedent and properly executed notice. Following that ruling, Mr. Lindell began a campaign to reframe the narrative. He omitted the reason for our original conflict. He omitted the lawsuit. He omitted the judgment. He presented himself as a victim of gentrification and has since led protests and online efforts to damage my reputation and my company. This is not a battle I asked for. I do not seek to discredit small businesses or remove character from our neighborhoods. But what I will not do, what I will never do, is remain silent while someone who disrespected me, dismissed me, and lied about me tries to rewrite the truth, to save his pride. There is no moral high ground in discrimination. There is no misunderstanding when two black women are turned away from a restaurant they own the building for. And there is no villain in this story, except the man who believed his version would be the only one anyone heard. She ended the post with a scanned copy of the original lease agreement, highlighting the expired terms, the month-to-month clause, and the rent adjustment notification with date and signature. No commentary, just the facts. All lined up like dominoes he had never imagined would fall in public. Within the hour, the reaction shifted. The thread began circulating first among Celeste's professional network, then through local business circles, and finally into the same social channels where Howard's narrative had first taken root. The contrast was stark. Where his version had leaned on emotion, on curated victimhood, Celeste's voice was clinical, steady, and undeniable. People who had once jumped to his defense now paused, reconsidered, and began deleting comments. Others issued soft apologies or offered support, stunned by the clarity she had delivered. She said no more after that. The post spoke for itself. By noon, the protest outside her building had dissolved entirely. A few holdouts remained, confused, scrolling through their phones as the story they thought they were part of shifted beneath their feet. Howard didn't return that day, nor the next. Inside her office, Jada stood behind Celeste, scrolling through the reactions in silence. "You really just waited," she said finally, and then dropped the truth like a bomb. Celeste looked out the window, her voice calm. "He needed noise. I waited for the silence." Jada exhaled slowly, and now Celeste turned back to her desk. Her hand slid across the folder she'd closed the day before, the one that held a blueprint, a contractor estimate, and a new commercial lease template, with a blank line for a future tenant's name. "Now I clean the space," she said. 2 weeks passed. The protests had ended. The news cycle, as always, had moved on. The hashtags slowed. The retweets stopped. And though Howard's version of the story still lingered in some corners of the internet, it no longer carried the heat of outrage or urgency. The wave had crested, then broken, and all that remained was the silence and the rent. The new rate had taken effect at the top of the month, and with it came a weight Howard hadn't truly understood until it began eating away at everything he had left. The first payment had been scraped together from what remained of his business savings, the cushion he'd built for emergencies. The second was paid late, patched together from withheld vendor checks, menu cuts, and a staff schedule so thinned it left the dining room half operational. The third wasn't paid at all. The attention he'd chased so fervently had failed to materialize into real support. The protesters didn't return to eat. The viewers who shared his videos didn't make reservations. The viewers who shared his videos didn't make reservations. Those who'd championed his name online rarely knew where his restaurant was located, let alone how to support it with their wallets. And the customers who had once been loyal, quiet, steady regulars who came for the food and stayed for the comfort, had started disappearing one by one. Some had read Celeste's post. Others had simply grown uncomfortable with the new tension in the air, the angry tone in Howard's voice when he spoke to staff, the clipped service, the empty tables, the shrinking menu. The restaurant that had once sold exclusivity now reeked of desperation. And in places like that, the energy shifted faster than the lights. By mid-month, the dining room was no longer full. His bar sat quiet on Saturday nights. Even his longtime server, Monique, had given notice with a sad kind of look in her eyes that made him want to scream. "I just need something more stable," she said, folding her apron for the last time. "It's not personal, Howard. You know that." But everything felt personal now, even the light, even the air. He sat alone one night in the darkened corner of the bar, the restaurant already closed, the front windows turned black by the night. The books were open in front of him. Ledgers, digital reports, credit card statements. The numbers had become a blur of red. The landlord had sent another notice, final this time. The rent was overdue. The late penalties were accruing. If not paid in full by the first of the next month, the lease would be terminated, and he would be given formal notice to vacate. He crumpled the letter in his fist and dropped it on the floor. The silence was unbearable. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had fought. He had gone public. He had made noise, drawn attention, demanded justice, but none of it had translated into preservation. His anger had not converted into rent. His slogans had not paid invoices. And now, piece by piece, he was watching everything he'd built unspool through his fingers. Upstairs, in her 15th floor office, Celeste sat by the window, sipping her tea as the city lights flickered into view. She no longer looked down at the restaurant. There was no need. The building would handle itself now. The lease was clear. The process was in motion. The timeline for removal, documented. The court ruling, indisputable. Jada entered quietly, a tablet in hand. "Notice of vacancy will go out Friday morning," she said, placing the tablet on the table. "He's still behind. Hasn't responded to any of the last 3 communications." Celeste nodded once, without looking at it. "Good. No protest this time," Jada said, her tone dry. "No camera, no hashtags, just silence." Celeste allowed herself a breath. "That's how some things end," she said. "Not with noise, just with truth that no longer needs defending." Jada looked at her, eyes narrowing with the hint of a smile. "You could have ended it months ago." "I didn't want to end it," Celeste replied. "I wanted him to feel it. Not just the loss, but the moment he realized it was all of his own making. And he did." Howard spent the last week of occupancy in a blur, selling off furniture, canceling contracts, avoiding eye contact with his last few remaining staff. The final night, he stood in the empty restaurant with the lights off, staring at the faint reflection of himself in the dark glass, remembering when it had once felt untouchable. Now, there was only the creak of the floorboards, the cold echo of an empty kitchen, and the lease on the counter with a signature that reminded him whose building he'd always been borrowing. When he locked the door for the final time, he didn't look back. He couldn't. Celeste didn't watch him leave. She didn't need to. She was already in her next meeting, reviewing tenant proposals with the quiet precision that had brought her here in the first place. The past didn't require an audience. It had already been resolved. The sun hung low over the skyline, casting long amber lines across the polished floor of Celeste's office as she stood by the window, fingers loosely clasped in front of her, watching the last of the evening settle over the city. The building below, once buzzing with deliveries, laughter, and the soft clink of silverware behind the windows of Lindell, now stood in silence. The restaurant had been emptied days ago. The sign was gone. The awnings rolled up. The space hollowed out, stripped down to bare walls and concrete floors, quiet, unoccupied, waiting. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't dramatic. It was just done. Jada sat behind her, scrolling through her phone, half reading an article about small business failures and post-pandemic leases, her voice low when she spoke. "Looks like he's not opening anywhere else," she said. "His domain expired. That little Save Lindell Instagram page hasn't posted since last week." Celeste didn't answer right away. She remained by the glass, eyes trained not on the empty restaurant, but on the street beyond it, where a young woman walked by with a laptop bag slung over her shoulder and a smoothie in hand, pausing briefly to check a flyer for the new cafe that would open in just a few weeks. Jada continued after a moment, tone softer now. "Do you think he really thought it would end differently?" Celeste finally spoke, her voice low and deliberate. "He didn't think it would end at all." There was no malice in the words, only observation, just the weight of truth settling where it belonged. She turned slowly, walking toward her desk, where a folder lay open with the newest tenant plans finalized and signed, ready to move forward. Her hand rested on the corner of the pages, but her gaze remained distant. "I've thought about it," she said, "more than I expected to. How different it all could have been." Jada looked up. "If he'd just seated us?" Celeste gave a faint nod. "Even after that, if he'd taken the rent increase and paid it, if he'd swallowed his pride instead of filing lawsuits and screaming into cameras, and trying to turn the city against me, he might have survived. Business was tight, yes, but not impossible. The restaurant wasn't failing until he made it fail. Pride's expensive, Jada said. Celeste's eyes narrowed slightly, still staring at the papers, but seeing beyond them. He wanted control more than he wanted to stay open. That was the mistake. He thought public sympathy could carry a business, that if he cried loud enough, people would come rushing to defend him. But he forgot that people eat where they feel comfortable, where they feel wanted. That restaurant had a history long before I walked through the door. And if we hadn't been the first ones turned away like that, we wouldn't have been the last. Jada leaned forward, her voice sharpening. He ran it like it was his stage. Every table was a spotlight he got to direct. But when the crowd left, he had no show left to sell. Celeste allowed herself the smallest breath of agreement. He let a door define him, and when it closed, he had nothing left to open. She walked around the desk now, sinking slowly into her chair, one leg crossing over the other with practiced ease. She glanced again at the folder, then closed it, the soft sound of the cover clicking into place, almost ceremonial. "I didn't want this," she said after a moment. "Not the protest, not the headlines, not the legal back and forth. I didn't want to make an example out of him, but he left me no choice." "Some people don't learn until it costs them something," Jada replied. "And even then, they blame the bill instead of the choice." Celeste smiled faintly, a smile not of victory, but of understanding. He thought he could control the story, but stories don't survive on spin. They survive on truth, and the truth was always sitting in the dining room. He just refused to see it. Outside, the wind shifted slightly, pulling at the edge of a construction tarp now draped across the front of the soon-to-be renovated space. Bright, clean signage was already taped to the glass. "Coming soon, herb and indigo, locally grown, black-owned, built for community." There were little flyers with QR codes and launch details, community opening day events, and calls for artist submissions for the back mural wall. It would be the kind of place that Howard could never have imagined. The kind of place built not for exclusivity, but for belonging. It wouldn't need velvet menus or white tablecloths or carefully curated wine pairings to prove its worth. It would be full because people wanted to be there, because the doors would open wide, and the welcome would be real. Celeste looked at the sign for a moment longer, then turned back to her desk, opening her laptop and scanning through the messages that had come in while she reflected. Vendors confirming, press requesting quotes, her management team updating build-out timelines, all moving forward, all in motion. Jada reached the door, then paused. "You ever think he's out there, still trying to figure out what went wrong?" Celeste met her eyes. "If he is, he'll never find it, because people like him don't look inward. They look everywhere else. That's why it ended the way it did." Jada nodded once, then left her alone in the quiet, the office filling with the last light of day. And Celeste sat still, not because she needed a moment to rest, but because she knew, fully and finally, that the story had landed exactly where it was meant to. Not with noise, not with anger, but with the truth, settled in place, like the final stone in a foundation that would hold. The soft chime of the cafe door opening echoed gently across the polished floors, folding itself into the low hum of voices and the faint rhythm of jazz that floated from the corner speaker. The scent of roasted sweet potatoes and rosemary filled the air, carried on steam rising from open kitchen windows where women in aprons worked with graceful focus. Warm light pooled in the corners of the room, diffused through amber sconces and filtered sunbeams that slid through tall glass panes newly installed just weeks earlier. Celeste stood near the back, half turned toward the mural that stretched across the length of the far wall. The painting was bold. 3 black women seated around a table not of linen or crystal, but of worn wood and clay pottery, surrounded by books, herbs, and flowers, their eyes lifted, not at each other, but toward something unseen. There was strength in their stillness, communion without explanation, presence without performance. She watched the cafe around her slowly begin to fill. Young families with strollers, college students with open laptops, an elderly couple from the co-op down the block who waved to the staff like regulars already. The sound was gentle, flowing, a kind of peace that didn't ask to be noticed, but wrapped around you once you stepped inside. Jada arrived late, her sunglasses still perched on her head, holding a small tote in one arm and 2 steaming cups in the other. She handed one to Celeste with a smirk. "Turmeric ginger with oat milk," she said. "I saw your name on the menu board. You've officially been immortalized." Celeste accepted the cup, her fingers wrapping slowly around the warmth. "They asked me to name something. I told them it wasn't necessary." Jada shrugged. "You didn't ask for a mural either, but they did that anyway." Celeste smiled, but her eyes stayed on the space, watching as a young girl pulled a chair out for her grandmother, gently placing her purse on the table beside her. A soft breeze passed through the open door, lifting a paper napkin, which a server caught mid-air with a laugh and a spin. "It's different now," Celeste said quietly. Jada followed her gaze. "It feels like it belongs here." "No," Celeste replied. "It feels like it always did. We just had to make room for it." They sat near the window, at a small round table with a potted basil plant resting between them. Outside, the city moved at its usual pace, steady, impatient, beautiful in its contradictions. People passed the storefront now without pause, without tension, without the heaviness that had once lived inside these walls. Where hesitation had lingered, there was now ease. Where performance had been required, now there was invitation. The space no longer carried the weight of resistance. It had been stripped, rewritten, rebuilt, not just in design, but in intention. Every table, every piece of art, every ingredient on the menu was part of a wider response to the question Celeste had posed the day she walked away from the restaurant that had refused to seat her. What does power look like when it chooses to welcome instead of exclude? The answer had taken time. It had taken loss. It had taken silence, patience, pressure, and an unflinching resolve to do nothing quickly, but everything with care. Jada reached into her bag, pulling out a folded newspaper. An old habit she refused to break. She slid it across the table to Celeste, her finger tapping an op-ed headline buried near the middle. "The Slow Collapse of Lindell. What Pride Costs Small Business Owners in Changing Cities." "Thought you'd want a copy," she said. "It's fair. Doesn't paint you as a villain. Doesn't paint him as a martyr either. Just lays it out." Celeste didn't pick it up. She just glanced down at the folded edge, then back at the window. "I don't need to read it," she said. "I lived it." Jada leaned back in her chair, sipping her tea. "You ever wonder what he's doing now?" "No." There was no bitterness in her tone, only finality. Celeste reached into her bag and pulled out her own folder, this one thinner than the ones that had guided her through the lease, the lawsuit, the transition. Inside were sketches, rough drafts of 3 more properties she'd recently acquired, each one sitting quietly at the edge of redevelopment zones, places where the city had not yet decided what they would become. Jada leaned forward, eyes scanning the layouts. "So, these are next?" Celeste nodded. "Each one will house something different. A co-working space, a wellness center, a bookstore cafe." Jada smiled. "Black-owned." Celeste didn't answer. She didn't need to. After a long pause, she folded the folder closed and looked back at the cafe, her gaze settling on the chalkboard near the front. Someone had written a quote in white script beneath the day's specials. Celeste read it silently, her lips barely moving. "We do not inherit spaces. We create them. We do not wait for welcome. We build home." She sat back in her chair, letting the words settle, letting the moment expand without filling it. And in that final quiet, as the cafe hummed around her, she knew this story hadn't been about a restaurant, a lease, or a man desperate to hold onto a corner he never truly understood. It had been about space, about dignity, about refusing to accept the terms of presence dictated by someone else. Howard had believed denying her a table would end the story. But all it did was shift the pen. And Celeste, once denied a seat, had gone on to own the room. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.